In this landscape photography tutorial, I will discuss 7 of the most common mistakes beginners make when they are photographing landscapes. Hi, I'm Kim from Landscape to Art, and I'm here to help you improve your landscape photography, focusing on developing your skills as a photographer and less on the gear you use. So if this is your first time here, make sure you click the subscribe button below. Landscape photography is one of the most challenging genres of photography, and there are several reasons for this. You cannot move your subject to a better location, and you cannot remove or add any light to the scenes you're photographing. You simply have to learn how to deal with the current conditions. And this is the very reason so many beginner landscape photographers struggle to get it right. You repeatedly make the same mistakes over and over because you're not even aware they are mistakes. So I hope in this video I will change that. So let's jump right in and look at the 7 most common mistakes. And mistake number 1 is photographing too much. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but don't get me wrong on this. You can never shoot too much, because the more you shoot, the more you photograph, the more you learn. So what I mean here is that a typical beginner mistake in landscape photography is you shoot too much without any intention and without having a plan or at least an idea of how you want to capture the scene in front of you. And you know, photography is an art, and most beginner photographers, they don't approach a scene with the mindset of an artist. Often there are no thoughts behind such photos, and most likely you don't even pay attention to the light conditions or the composition when you photograph. So here is the problem. Many photographers question their photos aren't looking good at all, and the thing is, you really can't take snapshots and then question later why your photos lack interest and are boring. That's not how photography works. Unless you do some planning or plan ahead, or it's going to be hard to improve your photography. So the key to landscape photography is to find a good subject and photograph it at the right time. You must be intentional when you photograph. When you approach a scene, stop and think, why do you want to take this photo? What was it that triggered you? And most likely it has something to do with light and colors. Another important aspect is if you approach photography this way, with intention and goal, it's much easier to evaluate the results when you're done. If the result is not near what you expected, you must take the time to review the photos. Take a closer look at them and find out what worked as intended and what did not work as you expected. Just identify the mistake you did and learn from them. And often mistakes are more important than successes, because mistakes forces you to reflect and make adjustments. Don't forget, learning is also a process, and there are no shortcuts to being a good photographer. And mistake number 2, too much in the frame. And this is a result of the mistake I discussed in the previous point, not being deliberate about what you're photographing. A typical beginner mistake is to include way too much in the frame. Because in front of a nice landscape, it's very easy to be captivated by the beauty, and so you decide you actually zoom out as much as you can on your camera and to include everything in the photo. Our eyes are capable of screening and processing a lot of information in the shortest amount of time. So when we stand in front of such a scene, we can take it all in and just enjoy it. We can use all our senses. We can hear and feel the wind. We can hear the water flowing or smell the flowers. But transforming all this into a well-made photograph is much more difficult. Whereas a photograph are 2-dimensional medium, our eyes sees the world in 3 dimensions. Because we see the world in 3D, we can easily distinguish different elements in the scene and how the elements relate to each other. If you include too many details in a composition, you will confuse the viewer, and he will probably just leave the photo immediately. So therefore it's so important to include a main subject or a main focus area, something that grabs the viewer's interest and attention. And if a scene is complex and have several focus areas, the easiest way to make the photo work is to move closer and isolate the most important focus area, the area that you want to highlight. This is essential in photography, and if you don't know what the main subject is yourself, how can you expect the viewers to know? If you're like most people, when there's nothing in the photo that immediately grab your interest, you quickly scroll to the next image. Photography is about removing everything unnecessary from a composition and make it clear and easy what you want the viewer to look at. And mistake number 3 is the wrong point of view. It's a reality that most photos are taken from eye level, and it's obvious, it's easy to understand because we all lift our camera up to our eyes when we take photos. And not only will this result in quite ordinary photos similar to everyone else's photo, but more important, when you shoot from eye level you miss an important element in photography, the depth I just talked about. So to create a sense of depth in a photo, one of the techniques you can use is to include something in the foreground. Adding a foreground is obviously not possible when you shoot from eye level, of course. But you can totally change an image just by kneeling down and include something that is close to the lens. It can be simple things like grass, flowers, or even a rock. When you add an interesting foreground, you create the depth, and the viewer's eyes will move from the foreground and into the image. Changing the point of view is not only about moving the camera down. Any change in camera position will change the perspective and how the different elements in the scene are positioned relative to each other. This is important when some of the elements are overlapping. You can improve the composition by making sure important elements in the scene don't merge or overlap. If the main subject is partially hidden behind a less important element in the frame, the image will lose its strength. So it's not working. In this image, for example, the rocks in the foreground are overlapping. And just by moving my camera slightly to the left, I was able to separate them. And this makes a big change, and the composition improves significantly. The best photographers try to find shooting angles that are different from everyone else. And if you want your photographs to stand out from the crowd, you should not try to be better, but because better is subjective. Instead, you should try to make your photos different. Because different will be, people will see when you make something different. I know it's not easy, but at least you should be aware of and deliberate about the composition when you take photos. And the more you practice, the better you get. And tip number 4 is not using a tripod. A tripod has one main purpose, and that's of course to keep the camera still. But the tripod also have other advantages that maybe not be so obvious. In the previous point I discussed point of view and how small changes in camera position can improve a photo drastically. And with the camera on a tripod, you are forced to slow down a little bit, and when you slow down you have more time to fine-tune the camera position and to find the best compositions. When you photograph something that is moving, like waves on a beach for example, you can just lock down the composition and concentrate on capturing the best waves when they recede from the beach. And also when you're with the camera on the tripod, you can experiment with different shutter speeds and apertures and learn how these settings change your photos, both exposure and the aesthetics. One of the most common issues with landscape photography is blurry photos. And the most typical reason for a blurry photo is camera movement. And as you learn landscape photography, at some point you will find yourself photographing when the light is dim, typically sunsets or night photography. And in this situation you must use a tripod because the shutter speeds are too long to handheld the camera. And mistake number 5, a tilted horizon. Our brain expects the horizon line to be leveled, and when it's tilted it's simply unnatural for us. The same applies to buildings and anything else we expect to be vertical. If the building is leaning to the left or to the right, we find it strange, something is off there. But despite the fact this is wired in our brains, many beginner photographers do it wrong. And I'm not sure, but I don't think it's because they don't know. It's probably the reason is probably more like lack of attention. And it takes so little efforts to make sure the horizon is straight when you take photos. In most cameras and even smartphones you can enable grid lines in the viewfinder or on the LCD, and this will help you leveling the horizon. And another reason why we see so many tilted horizon might be that it's so easy to fix them in post. And some photographers might think that they will do that. They will fix the horizon later when they post-process, and then they just forget about it. And mistake number 6 is overexposing the highlights. In many situations in landscape photography, the contrast in a scene is so high that it's not possible to expose both for the highlights and the shadows properly. You have most likely experienced this yourself, and the sky is way too bright and the foreground is too dark. And it's easy to think that the camera will produce the exact same as we see with our eyes, but unfortunately it's not that easy. Cameras are limited compared to the human eye and will struggle with extreme contrast. And the technology has improved significantly over the last few years, but the problem is still not solved. And in extreme situations you must resort to other tools or methods to get a good exposure. If you photograph a high contrast scene, the absolute worst thing you can do is to overexpose the sky. It's not possible to recover an overexposed sky no matter what camera or software you use. If you have no other options or tools available, just expose for the sky and leave the foreground too dark. Unless the contrast is extreme and more than the dynamic range of your camera can handle, you can most likely fix this when you post-process. And in particular if you save your files as RAW files, which I highly recommend you to do. With a RAW file you can recover a lot of details from the shadowy areas in post. So really don't give up the photos that looks like a failure on the LCD screen until you have tested it in your editing software. And if you want to learn more about how to deal with high contrast scenes, you can take a look at this video. And mistake number 7 is perfectionism. And this is a huge one. We all have some level of perfectionism in us, and ideally we want to be experts before we dare to show our images to other people than our friends and family. We are simply afraid of the negative feedback that we might get. The lack of courage makes you think you need to learn more first, so you watch a few more blog posts and YouTube videos. And this approach can keep you in the learning loop forever. Maybe you have a few favorite photographers you are learning from. You try to be as good as them before you have the gut to show your work to the public. You just want your photos to look like theirs, and just because they are the experts in your eyes. But what is really an expert? How much do you need to know before you're an expert? It's not an easy answer. And an expert is someone who knows more about a topic like photography. They know more than you do. But this doesn't mean there aren't someone else that knows even more about the same topic than your expert does. So if this holds true, you're an expert too, in the eyes of someone that knows less about photography than you do. In some way we are all experts, but on different levels. If you suffer from perfectionism, you run the risk of never get started, because perfectionism leads to procrastination. And unless you let go of the fear of not being good enough, your photography will suffer forever. Because perfectionism is an illusion. You will never be perfect in anything you do in life, no matter how hard you try. So I hope you found these tips valuable. Maybe you find yourself guilty in doing one or more of these mistakes. The last mistakes I covered, being a perfectionist, is probably the most important and most difficult to deal with as a photographer. But it's very important to stop the procrastination. If you never get started experiencing mistakes and failures, you're not going to improve your photography skills. So now if you like this video, consider giving it a thumbs up, and thank you so much for watching. And as usual, if you have any comments or questions, post them in the comment section below the video, and I will get back to you. So until next time, ha det bra, goodbye.